November 20th, 3112, 6 days later. Aboard Prancer, approaching low Earth orbit. Well, I asked. The virtual voice of Naomi remained silent. I was waiting for her reply in the virtual recreation of Nautilus, where we had met previously. It was just me and the AI in this meeting, as Uxe, Rami, and Omu remained awake in reality back on Prancer. The torch ship had dropped out of high-G deceleration 10 minutes ago and was now using its thrusters to maneuver to a parking orbit near Gateway Sigma. The trip inward from Vesta had nearly exhausted the torch, and it would need replacement of its three main consumables: reactor, fissionables, lithium-6, and saltwater. This meant unless we found another fully fueled torch, we were stuck in near-Earth orbit or on the surface for at least a month. That was not a concern, as our plans on Earth would likely take a while to come to fruition. Still, the AI did not reply. My goal from this virtual meeting was to confirm our attempt to complete the Forbin experiment and to secure Naomi's help. I had asked the AI for its help, but not yet mandated it. The AI was considering the issue now. Naomi finally replied, "John, I have conferred with Omu, who has relayed the technical details of your request. While it is true that Uxe, Truffles, and Omu have removed many of the risks of utilizing the Forbin complex to solve the main problems with wormhole technology, there are still dangers. I would urge you to find an alternative method to resolve the problems." Will you aid our attempt if I mandate it? Yes. Whew, the AI had answered instantly, which was telling. Hesitation would have meant the AI was struggling or considering loopholes. What do you think the odds are of something going wrong if we use Forbin? I asked next. 12% plus or minus 3% of complications arising during the experiment or later during data extraction. 3% plus or minus 2% of those complications escaping the Forbin security perimeter and causing extensive harm to humanity, the AI answered soberly. Ouch, a 1 in 20 chance for causing a disaster of our own making. Were the risks worth taking? What are the odds of the assemblage discovering our control of Sol system either before or during the Orcs' passage in time to attack us offensively? 28% plus or minus 14%. What about if we are able to harness the wormhole technology and use it to preemptively attack or defend ourselves? I asked. Assuming solutions can be found to the four primary obstacles already identified by Uxe in assuming a preemptive attack is possible, the chances of the assemblage surviving such an attack to later cause harm to Sol system are only 5%, plus or minus 3%, Naomi answered. This time the answer had come with a bit of a delay. The calculations had clearly been more involved. Still, it was clear that if we could utilize the wormhole technology, we would significantly lower the risks humanity would face from the assemblage passage. It appeared that the rewards might be worth the risks of using Forbin. Naomi, what are the odds that the wormhole problems can be solved by using the Forbin array? Naomi did not reply. Also, the simulated environment of the interior of Nautilus had frozen. After a few more moments, the simulation faded completely away, and my virtual representative was left standing in a simple white room. What was happening? Before I began to panic, I saw that there was still an exit icon showing on one wall. I assumed this meant that I could leave and return to reality at any time. So I decided to wait for a bit longer. Finally, after what seemed like many minutes, the sparse white room faded, and I was back in the recreation of the Nautilus. I apologize for the interrupted virtuality, John. The calculations required to precisely answer your last question consumed all of my available processing capacity. Despite utilizing my maximum capabilities, I was unable to determine the chances of success regarding the utilization of the Forbin complex, Naomi explained. I'd never seen the AI brought to its knees like that before. I needed to understand if the cause was some moral conflict going on in the AI with regards to my safety. Can you explain why, Naomi? I carefully probed. Yes, I lack the capability to fully understand the theoretical solutions to the issues remaining with respect to the wormhole issue as well as with certain fundamental issues of wormhole technology itself. A complete understanding of both is required to accurately estimate the chances of the Forbin array solving the four major problems. Naomi must have sensed I was not following its explanation as it attempted to simplify its response. I am not smart enough to calculate its chances of success, John. I am sorry. In hindsight, it was obvious. The question I had asked Naomi was like asking a mortal to think like a god. No, it's my fault for asking a question you are incapable of answering, Naomi. I should have realized that no AI could think like a Forbin super AI without becoming a Forbin super AI itself. It looked like this was as much information as I was going to get as far as deciding if we should move forward with Yux's plan. As things stood now, I was leaning towards making the attempt. Besides, no one was sure what the results of a Forbin breakout would be. It might be disastrous, or it might be benign, or it might even be beneficial. I paced around the simulated Nautilus thinking. I began to notice slight differences in this recreation as compared to the actual submarine I had lived on for nearly a year. On a whim, I walked aft from the main salon to where my old bunk space had been. What I found was a completely different version of my old quarters. This virtual one was much more extravagant. The head was larger, and the bunk space had a king-size bed. I moved further aft and inspected the recreation of the medical bay. Here I found a much larger space with a dozen creche units. Interesting. Why was Naomi simulating something that had never existed or was not needed here in virtuality? Something occurred to me. Naomi, where are you currently housing your physical processing units these days? They have been transferred from the High Castle space station back to the Earth's surface, John. The AI did not volunteer more details beyond that. I could have pressed it, but I decided that it did not really matter. We had built tens of thousands of processing clusters all across the planet and connected them with ultra-high bandwidth data links as part of the simulated environment ruse for use against the assemblage. Naomi could be using any of those, or even many all at once. I returned to the salon. I had made up my mind, and it was time to wrap this up. I've decided, Naomi. I think the risks of using the Forbin complex are worth it. We will move forward and attempt to solve the wormhole problems. I mandate that you aid us in this effort. Of course, John. I will assist you as you require, Naomi replied directly. All good so far. I intend to accompany the others to the Forbin platform and assist them in preparing the experiments. Will there be any issues with that? I asked. No, John. I understand that this is your choice and that you are currently in full possession of your unimpaired faculties. I will comply with your requests and aid you in the preparations. Good. I wanted to be sure the AI would not abandon me there and wake up one of my backups to take over my role as its conscience. I will begin sending instructional message packets to the firewalled Neokoros security AI on Forbin. The packets will compel the AI's cooperation and cause it to begin preparations to ready the facility for your arrival. Note, according to the published schedules, the current experiments in progress will not be completed for 4 days. Do you wish that these be terminated immediately? I didn't need to consult with the others to know that doing so would only raise awareness of our activities and likely cause trouble. No, let them finish as planned. Will inserting our experiment into their schedule cause issues? There will be some rescheduling required, John. However, this happens occasionally at Forbin, as equipment unexpectedly fails and should cause no undue alarm. After the current experiments are concluded, it will take an additional 4 days to reconfigure the facility to receive your specialized equipment. Good. 8 days until we would need to physically go there. I would have to talk to Yux and Rami about their plans. It was November, so South Dakota would be chilly. I was always up for the warm Seychelles, but I had my suspicions that a humid jungle visit might be in Ux's future. I wondered if she would drag Rummy along with her, or let him choose his own mini-vacation destination. I did not mind splitting up for a week. We had just finished a week of high-G close-quarters contact aboard Prancer on our trip from Vesta to Earth. If it had not been for the escape of limited virtuality, I'm sure we would have been at each other's throats. Thank you, Naomi, I said as I signaled for our virtual meeting to end. The next 8 days passed with a mix of leisure, worry, and even a bit of parental drama. After my virtual meeting with Naomi, I had returned to find the others waiting to board the small shuttle pod. Prancer had reached its parking orbit, and it was time to transfer over to Gateway Sigma. It was a full pod with the 4 of us and the cargo we had brought to conduct our experiment at Forbin. We split up after we arrived at the station. Omu and I caught a lander heading to India. From there, we rented an electrojet to take us southwest. A few hours later, we were sitting on the beach at heels in the sand. The island was currently empty of other humans as my previous guests had moved on. But I did not really mind the solitude. I had Omu for company and even had a few nice swims and chats with Ticklefin, the Ultra Dolph. He and his pod were still hanging around the area. Uksha and Rami headed to South America. She would be checking in on her ancestral home in the Amazon reserve. The primitive human tribes who had sole dominion over those lands were thriving, and Uksh still had residence rights allowing her to come and go freely. Omu explained that there was still a modern medical facility where Uksha was headed, which had fully modernized guest quarters. Rami would at least get to enjoy air conditioning while they were there. A few days into our separate vacations, Ux and I met up in virtual. We went as a mother and father to visit our daughter Kayla Ux Abrams. She was living full-time in the deep virtual world of the Assemblage SRP, or Simulated Reality Project. This was the fake alternate Earth that had been created only to fool any assemblage agents who arrived digitally to scout the Earth ahead of the Ark's arrival. It had been a massive project which had reached initial operational status well over a century ago. In the SRP, the Earth was still under the control of the Master AI, the assemblage's control agent here on Earth. Humanity existed in the simulation only as fully managed populations in template colonies scattered across the biomes of the planet. Of course, other than a few active programmer caretakers, all the digitally simulated humans existed as pause creations. If the assemblage scouts did arrive, they would be resumed into an active state, and the timeline of the full simulation quickly altered to match the events of whatever time period was needed. Hopefully, we would never need to use the simulation. But if digital enemy agents ever did arrive, we had a place to stuff them. And if the SRP was convincing enough to fool them about the situation on the Earth, we needed those agents to report that false information back to the Ark which had sent them. Why go through the effort? We needed to hide the true reality of our control of Sol's system until it was too late for the Ark to do anything about it. It was risky, but being a simulation, we could start dozens of versions of the SRP simultaneously using copies of the enemy scouts and only continue running those that were successful with the subterfuge. I had popped into the SRP simulation at its main developmental meeting site. This was where the human programmers and AI presences working on the simulated reality would meet to discuss progress and consider additions or modifications. It took me a bit longer to appear in this virtuality than it had in other simulations. I understood this was due to the much higher resolution of this world. I quickly had noticed that my virtual body was different. I finally recognized and remembered its appearance was how my shell would have looked back in the year 2950. This would have been around the time that Kayla would have been 10 years old. A few minutes later, Yux had popped in beside me. Her virtual appearance also matched that of her living shell of 160 years ago. We had shared a look of concern while we studied each other's unexpected appearance. Soon we had begun to explore the entry lobby we had arrived in, looking for our daughter. There had been many doors, but all were closed. A voice sounded behind us. "Hello, Mother." "Hello, Father. I apologize for altering your virtual appearances without your consent. I wanted to see you as I remembered you as a child." We turned to find our daughter standing just outside the entry lobby on some sort of terrace. She stood there facing us with her hands clasped solemnly in front of her. Her virtual appearance was strange. It was slowly morphing its features. At times it looked like our daughter as a teenager. At other times as an older woman. We eventually joined her on the terrace. Kayla hugged us, which helped to diffuse the somber mood. She then led us to a series of benches lining the terrace, and the three of us had gotten reacquainted with one another. It proved to be a mixture of good and bad. At times, Kayla had resembled the bright, inquisitive, and contemplative little girl we had raised a century and a half ago. Other times, she had seemed withdrawn, reserved, and hollow. If I had to guess, I'd say that a long time ago she had gotten depressed, and this had shaped the virtually somewhat and affected her digital personality. Ugly feedback loops like that had been known to happen. After we had talked for half an hour, I had secretly paused the main virtual session and opened a side-channel virtuality session with Yux to discuss the matter. She quickly agreed with my suspicions, and we had contacted Dionys, the AI overseeing the SRP. I'm not sure what Dionys had made of two worried parents grilling it about one of its key human partners. But we did manage to get the AI to agree to a higher level of oversight with regards to the mental state of our daughter. With our goal accomplished, we signaled for the side-channel chat to end. Kayla had frowned as the main simulation resumed. I think she had caught on that we had been having a private chat. But soon our discussions switched from the personal and back to her work in the SRP. She still had pride in this simulated world, as her direct input and hard work was behind many of its innovative features. One of the key features of the SRP was its adaptability to new discoveries about the assemblage's goals and plans. She had been largely responsible for implementing those flexible control aspects of the simulation. The tame version of the master AI they had installed in this world was a good example. It was a dual-personality AI and acted as if this world were real and still under the overall control of the assemblage. Its deeper, hidden personality was as a puppet master who oversaw everything and coordinated this place with the real world where humanity was in control. Kayla had demonstrated features of the simulated world. As I saw the pride in my little girl, a part of me actually hoped the assemblage would send its digital scouts. Then this place would have a true purpose, and she would have a chance to better prove her worth to humanity. I suspected that would go a long way to healing much of what was ailing my daughter. We had all sensed the point where our visit was nearing its natural endpoint. We had managed one good thing while we were there, and that was the promise from Kayla to visit us in the real world in a real physical shell at some point in the near future. It would be a while as we had our critical experiment coming up. Also, I wanted the virtual Kayla to get used to the idea, as I suspected it would be quite a shock to her. We had shared a three-way hug before Orcs winked out to return to South America. I had exited last and had headed back on my island to resume my beachcombing. A few days later, Naomi contacted Omu and me to tell us that the work to prepare Forbin for our experiment was proceeding as planned. The AI had worked with the Neokoros security AI to arrange unscheduled leaves for a large portion of the human work staff on the platform. It had also begun shipping in the hundreds of specialized quadruped mobile units we had ordered constructed. We would need the automated workforce to do the last-minute reconfigurations to the physical relays connecting the various parts of the processor lattice. Naomi also informed us that the additional high-capacity ESUs we would be using for the experiment had been delivered to the underground receiving area from the manufactories on the Florida mainland. All would be ready for our arrival in the morning. I had Naomi contact Orcs and Rami and add them to our virtual session. After they were brought up to speed on the progress of the preparations, we decided on how to go about getting to the platform. Since I still had the Electrojet rental, it was determined that Omu and I would fly to the Zamora, Ecuador spaceport this evening. I would sleep on the 5-hour flight and arrive somewhat fresh. That was the spaceport where we had shipped our experiment cargo down from Gateway Sigma a week ago. Uoxe and Rami would meet us there a few hours before dawn. Then we would retrieve our cargo from holding and load it onto the Electrojet. From Zamora, the Forbin platform was just a 90-minute flight almost directly north. We would arrive an hour after dawn. Naomi also reported that an orbital launch vehicle was scheduled to take off from Ecuador later tomorrow night, heading to Gateway Sigma. If all went as planned at Forbin, our experiment would be successfully concluded, and we could make it back to the Zamora launch facility in plenty of time to catch that launcher. Once at Gateway, the AI was holding a lunar shuttle which had just completed a minor overhaul. We would use that to make our escape off-planet. I hoped escape was a gross overstatement, and our leaving was more of a calm departure. Our goal was to be in and out without making waves. But you could never count on humanity to let a plan proceed logically. Something was bound to go wrong. The AI reassured us that it also had alternative ways to orbit should something unexpected arise. I had my own theories about that which I kept to myself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next day, a bit after dawn, we were in the rented Electrojet flying northward at Mach 3 towards the Forbin platform. We had removed half the passenger seats from the rear of the cabin to make room for our cargo. Uksa, Rami, and Omu were seated with me in the remaining 4 passenger seats in the forecabin. I was in a rearward-facing seat for this trip and could see our cargo secured in the aft cabin behind us. It was a mix of containers of various sizes. 2 were smaller suitcase-sized memory modules of the type commonly used to physically transport large amounts of data or smaller AI presences. We were using these to transport our test program, including all our input data and algorithms. They would be used to establish the initial conditions of the experiment and also to help guide its progress as it ran. A third larger crate contained static processor blocks. These were capable of housing a smaller AI presence but lacked wireless input or output capabilities. They also had very limited onboard power supplies, which would allow them to operate for a short time independent of the Forbin array's power supply status. Our hope was to use the partial AI presences in the static processors to guide the experiment once it began. The static processors would also be used to pattern the results at its conclusion into a data format that we could safely extract. The final 4 containers were large and ruggedly constructed. Each housed a high-capacity, secure memory module, complete with its own built-in sustaining power supply and a Faraday cage enclosure. The 4 modules were for the extraction of the data we hoped to obtain from the experiments. Leaving the electromagnetic security perimeter of Forbin with the 4 modules intact would break the most sacrosanct security rule of the complex and likely condemn us in the eyes of our peers. That rule was that nothing with complicated electronics could leave the test area, ever. If word got out that we had left the secured enclosure with active memory units, all hell would likely break loose. Hopefully, our safeguards would work, and the units would prove to both be safe and to contain the answers we sought. Success in both would go a long way towards diffusing the troubles we would be creating. I was filled with worry, and I suspected Orcs and Rami were also a bit troubled, as there was little conversation on the flight. Even Omu was silent. To distract myself, I went back to staring out the porthole of the electrojet, watching the deep blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico passing below us. I spotted the wake of a large ocean-going freighter. It must have been huge to be visible from our current altitude. I checked the map and noticed that our current location was about halfway between Florida and the Yucatan Peninsula. If I remembered right, the Gulf was much deeper here than it was where the Forbin platform was located. "Omo, how deep is the Gulf here?" I asked. 3,400 meters, John. The seafloor begins to grow much shallower 80 kilometers to the north of our present location. Just as I remembered, the Gulf had very deep areas as well as a large shallow seabed west of Florida. I thanked Omu and continued to watch the ocean passing below. In a minute, the jet began to slow and descend. I had to wait my turn as Ux got up and beat me to the lavatory. Rami looked like he needed to use the facilities too. We landed without incident. The platform was much quieter today than it had been during my previous visit. Administrator Sabal did not meet us as it had been sent to the mainland. The few early morning occupants of the topside recreation greenhouse mostly ignored our landing. What did meet us were 6 mobile units who retrieved our cargo containers from the electrojet. I acted like I had been here many times before and swiftly led the others inside into the lift heading below. The elevator ride to the underground cargo transfer depot proceeded normally enough. Ix and Rami looked a little apprehensive when the crystalline elevator dipped below the waves. Omu and I were old hats at this and were nonchalant about the descent. Well, I acted nonchalant. Inside, I was probably just as nervous as the other 2 humans were. We arrived at the cargo depot level just below the seafloor and had our first interactions with other humans. 2 cargo handlers were waiting to speak with us about the vac tube load of mobile units which had arrived an hour ago from the manufactories on the Florida coast. Omu had to authorize their continued passage below by using her digital override. Luckily, that was all it took to reassure the pair of humans, and soon the automated cargo handlers began to load our gear onto the 2 waiting freight elevators. The smaller passenger elevator was currently at the bottom of the complex and just beginning its return. To spare a 20-minute wait, we rode down in one of the freight elevators with the mobile units. The ride was much noisier and quite a bit rougher than the one in the passenger lift I had taken last time, but we survived. The top of the freight lift had openings that allowed us to see the long shaft above us. Ux and Rami were awed at the depth of our descent. Finally, 10 minutes later, we were at the bottom and at the first secured entry portal, leading to the actual Forbin experimental data center. Omu got us through without issue. Now we would begin to do things that would not be looked at kindly by the AI advisory group, nor our human peers when they found out. We would need to proceed cautiously using diplomacy, authority, and in the case of particularly stubborn humans, deception. The security AI Neokros was under the control of Naomi's authority, but there was still the human element to deal with. Omu left us and headed to the smaller secure data center where the Neocross AI was housed. There were physical fail-safes which would need to be disabled by the android's direct interface. Rami also left Ux and me at the entry. He was needed in the ESU energy storage facility. Naomi had given him temporary supervisor access credentials, and he would be overseeing the human personnel remaining there to modify the power supply ESUs to suit the needs of our experiment. A dozen of our mobile units would also be heading there to assist him. Our plan was to rig the ESUs to release their power in a staggered and ordered way. This was a departure from the normal experiments which had been run here, and Rami was needed to verify that all the specialized connections and relays were set up properly. He was also there to allay any concerns the human workers had about the non-traditional and potentially security-breaching power distribution format. Hopefully, they would buy his story, and he would not need to resort to using the mobile units to subdue them. We would be using fewer overall ESUs than some long-duration tests had used in the past, but we were wiring them up to the lattice array in an unconventional manner. This would result in only various parts of the large processor array receiving power at certain times, only if certain conditions had been met, the latter being the potential security breach if handled incorrectly. Yux and I went to the main work area, where equipment was prepared for installation into the secured experiment chamber, and old equipment was processed for disposal. This area looked like a large and busy warehouse with acres of replacement equipment stored on rows of high racking. We quickly found our cargo and mobile units, which had just arrived from the lifts. Yuxa got busy opening our cargo packages while I triggered the self-deploy mode on the pallets of mobile units. Once they were standing in ranks, we both moved among them, connecting each with shielded optical cables. For EM safety, the mobile units had been custom designed to not have wireless data links. Soon they were all daisy-chained together. Yux then uploaded our custom programming into each of the units. This took only seconds as the programming was basic and non-sentient. Groups of units quickly disconnected and grabbed various pieces of our equipment before heading to the EM security portals leading into the main processor dome. There was a bit of a traffic jam as the mob waited for the locks to cycle. The mobile unit's job was to reconfigure the physical relays which existed between various sections of the huge processor lattice. The relays would act in conjunction with our staggered supply of electrical power to only allow certain portions of the array to be energized at a time under our direct control. Omu rejoined us as we worked. The android had one special task to perform here, with a dozen static processors waiting to be taken into the test chamber. She needed to physically link with them and copy part of her presence. Truffles had volunteered to provide the guiding intelligences before we left Vesta, but Omu had overruled that AI and insisted on providing them herself. Her partial presences in the static processors would be in the experiment chamber during the test. They would face the full brunt of the evolving hyperintelligence and hopefully guide it towards solving our wormhole problems. It was expected that the small presences would not retain integrity during this, so in many ways it was a suicide mission. When the android had finished, she just disconnected without saying anything. The static processors had one small output channel, which was a quantum-protected optical cable. This cable led outside the secured testing dome to our unit we would be installing in the main control room. This data link was the potential weak point in our plan to maintain the chamber's integrity, and Omu and Truffles had gone to an enormous effort to design the link to be safe and secure. When I expressed my doubts, they further explained that the link had optical isolators where it passed through the EM security boundary. The isolators used very slow, as compared to machine time, acting analog filaments to repeat signals leaving the secured chamber. The filaments had to physically heat up and cool down to retransmit any bits of data they received outward as analog cycles. The detectors on the outside were set to ignore all but the most extreme points of the analog signal. Thus, the isolators became simple on or off triggers, very slow-acting triggers. With such a slow bandwidth, any meaningful data breach would take millennia from the perspective of a hyperintelligence. We only needed a few bits of data to make it through the security perimeter in order to trip the power relays back in the ESU room. And just to prove that we were not completely batshit reckless, with our casual use of electronic equipment in the EM security areas, all of the mobile units and relay nodes we had taken into the secured chamber were equipped with small, mechanically timed thermite charges. A short time after the conclusion of the test, their processors and memories would melt down, rendering their carcasses safe for later disposal in the facility's smelters. We'd be long gone by then, and that mess would be someone else's responsibility. Our public relations firm would need to work overtime after this. Back to the present, with the mobile units now entering the main dome, we needed to hurry. Their entry would register on the displays in the control center. This would no doubt greatly disturb the senior controller currently on duty there. As soon as we were done here, the control center was our next destination. I motioned to Omu to help me with the heavy data modules which were needed up in the control room. We followed Ukes to the local cargo lift, as the secured control room was one level above us. The control room was staffed by a senior controller at all times. This even included now, despite our ruse of heavy maintenance causing most of the human staff to be away on leave. Sure enough, we ran into issues with this controller. First, she had noticed our almost 200 mobile units enter the secured experiment dome against protocol. Then she had observed the unprecedented modifications being done in the ESU power supply chamber. Finally, she tried to report both events and found the communication system was down due to Omu's earlier work in the security data center. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and now she was in a full panic. Our passing through the security portals unchallenged only increased her upset to the point where she would not even look at our digital authorization or listen to our cover story for being in her domain. I was sure glad that there were no weapons in the control room as I tried to calm her down. As I slowly approached her with my palms out, I read her name tag and saw that her last name was Zabel. I remembered that this was the same Z who had manned the controls when Yeshur Sabal had run its demonstration for Beatrice and me a few months ago. I tried to use that information to distract her. Z, please calm down. I don't know why you missed the messages about the deep shutdown and diagnostics work. We are here to pull the circuit breakers while the array is closed down completely for extensive repairs. She looked confused when I used her nickname. I knew that she couldn't recognize me in my new shell, but was not sure if she knew Omu. I had been casually moving as I spoke, and I now had her turned mostly away from Omu. Omu must have taken this as a sign, as faster than a striking cobra. The android darted in and injected a sedative directly into the woman's neck. It was very fast-acting, and she began to sway almost before I could reach her. "Damn it, Omu! Did you have to do that?" I asked, clearly upset. Omu did not answer but rushed in to help me support the sagging women. Together we maneuvered the confused and likely pissed-off woman to the floor in the corner of the room. There I held her carefully as she struggled weakly and slipped fully unconscious. The android checked her vitals and added a dermal patch to her neck, which contained a long-duration sedative. Z would be out for hours. To spare her dignity, I hoped she hadn't needed to use the bathroom. "John, you realize that Miss Zabel now has valid grounds for claiming assault. We may face a lawsuit stemming from this incident in the near future," Omu explained to me. "Can you estimate what the expected judgment might be?" S15,000 to S20,000, depending upon the extent of her anger and humiliation. Ouch! I imagine the higher amount was a sure thing if Miss Zabel did end up pissing herself. Well, I was definitely responsible. Maybe we could get ahead of this scandal. "Do I have that much scut?" I asked the android. "Yes, although you will have to access your separate stipend account for some of it." "Good. I decided to handle this issue right now. OMU, register a settlement offer for S25000 with her message service. Post-date it for tomorrow and include the standard clause about no further actions being allowed if the settlement offer is accepted. Oh, add my personal apologies for her situation. Yes, John, I have submitted the settlement offer, including a bond for S25000. I predict from Miss Zabel's history that she will agree to the generous settlement terms." I felt a little better about our mistreatment of Z. She would enjoy a healthy profit from our forcing her to take a nap while on the job. I was also reminded that I really needed to get a handle on my finances, my long-ignored stipend account in particular. Yux was already busy uploading our test conditions and wormhole data into the Forbin array input registers. Omu moved to assist her. "How are we doing time-wise?" I asked Omu as they worked. "We are on schedule. The physical alterations in the secured experiment chamber should be completed in 40 minutes. Rami should have the final energy storage units configured and linked to the new physical relays in 25 minutes. Our preparations here with the input registers should be completed around the same time, Omu explained. Display screens were showing the ongoing activities in both the energy storage chamber and the secured experiment dome. I could see Rami and his dozen mobile units moving around in the ESU chamber. He was busy at a power distribution board verifying the changes that the mobile units were making. The work they were doing rerouting superconductor cabling reminded me of old-time phone operators switching phone lines, but on a larger scale. Another display showed various views in the large security dome. I could see our almost 200 mobile units busy across the chamber. Some were adding our special nodes and the static processors, with Omu's partial presence to various locations in the lattice array of processors. Others were stringing optical cabling from the physical relays spread throughout the chamber and running it back to the access portal in the chamber's electromagnetic barrier. There, the cables would be connected to the optical isolators, which would transmit the sanitized ultra-low bitrate signals outside the security perimeter. Eventually, those simple signals would make their way to this control room, where they would be interpreted by a custom, extremely secure processor module. The interpreter module would then use the data which originated in the active experiment array to control the power relays in the ESU hall. UX had simplified and explained to me what our overall goal here was. It was to create a new hyperintelligence that was saturated from its very beginning with our wormhole theories and problems. Then as it grew, our special nodes would force it to assimilate even more complex wormhole theories and problems. If we balanced things right, the evolving hyperintelligence would be unable to not think about our problems. A feedback loop would help force its thoughts. If it evolved correctly, the custom nodes would report that back to the control room via the secured optical cables. The static processor in the control room would then activate the appropriate relays to reward the growing intelligence with additional power. So just like training a dog by giving it treats or providing punishment, we would be doing the same here by adding or denying energy. We needed to rigidly control its growth, and this meant at times limiting it. If it grew too fast and uncontrolled, the artificial intelligence could be lost forever in a solipsistic sinkhole of self-contemplation. Our goal was to delay that inevitable point by continually stuffing increasingly difficult, ultra-complex wormhole problems down its throat. The final part of our plan was to gather any data the rapidly evolving hyperintelligence managed to produce regarding the wormhole issues and guide it into the 4 self-contained memory units. If our calculations were correct, near the end of the experiment, the hyperintelligence would have evolved so far that it would ignore the memory modules as being inconsequential for its own needs. This had been observed in previous experiments, and we hoped it to also be the case for ours. For the same reason, we expected that the hyperpresence would have evolved beyond the need for animosity or revenge. Both were illogical and would be ignored. In fact, it was likely that it would not even notice our feeble semi-AI presences in the static processors as they scurried around like cockroaches, salvaging any useful crumbs of data. If it did detect our data preservation efforts, it might even actively cooperate and better format the data packages. That was the plan. Now to see if it worked. UX finished installing the preload conditions and data into the Forbin input registers. Soon Rami rejoined us, having finished his work in the ESU chamber. All that remained was the installation of our 4 self-contained memory modules, just ahead of the output register buffers down in the output hall. UXA and I left to go perform the installation of our memory units in the output register hall, while Rami and Omu remained here in the control room. Rami was needed here because it was hard-coded that a human be present at all times. Omu stayed because the output register hall was too risky for the unshielded AI to enter. The risks were actually very low, but keeping the android out of sensitive areas would go a long way towards lowering the suspicions humans would have towards Omu after this was over. First, Yox and I returned to the equipment storage area where we had left the memory modules. I found a trolley and pushed them to the EM barrier access door leading to the output register hall. Out of an abundance of caution, Uxie and I wore shielding caps to protect our cranial implants. Uxie's was quite extensive, as it had to shield the more exposed data ports lining the back of her augmented skull. We had all left our personal electronics, such as my genealogy amulet, back on the electrojet, so we did not have to worry about those. One by one, I cycled the memory modules through the electromagnetic portal. Yux began working to connect them to the Forbin output register data lines. She was using an automated coupling tool, which would have to be destroyed after we were done. 15 minutes later, I watched her finish up on the final memory module. She set aside her coupling tool after first activating its destruct timer. Then, after one last look around the foreboding output register chamber, we departed through the EM security lock. She was looking very anxious as we made our way back to the control room, so I gave her a hug. I was ready to finish this experiment and get the hell out of here just as much as she was. After we reached the control room, Neokros announced that the last of the non-essential human workers had been safely sent out of the way and up to the surface on an evacuation drill. This reduced the chances of anyone sabotaging or accidentally interfering with our test once it began. There were still a few humans down below who we would have to keep an eye on, but for the moment, Neokros had them busy doing meaningless distraction tasks. Uxe took over at the control station and began the turn-your-key procedures for accepting the current input register settings. Neokros acted as the second safety with Meowing providing the third by using a portable admin console. Once that was accomplished, we sent the commands which opened the final safety disconnects to the ESUs which would be used in the experiment. Neokros also implemented full safeties in the test chamber. All unneeded power was disconnected, and all cameras were retracted and sealed behind the EM barrier. All access portals were closed, and the passive sensors showed no humans or active electronics were in any outer areas near the barrier. The ready board showed full green. We were ready. Now, Neokros transferred final control authority for the release of ESU power into the array to our console here. UX now had full control over when to begin the experiment. She paused from doing just that to look at Rami, Omu, and me. "Well, wish us luck," she said. "Luck," Rami and I responded. Omu remained silent but put its arms around the both of us briefly. Ux then began the second turn-your-key procedure needed to close the first power relay. In 3, 3, 2, 1, turn. Epilogue. Year 3114, 2 years later. Sol System, the defensive AI known by contemporary humans as Minervus, noted the unexpected report just received from its very long baseline sensor array located in a distant polar orbit around the Sun. An energy detection had been observed at the expected location of the approaching assemblage ARC vessel. The AI quickly analyzed the initial data and determined that the signals being received had indeed been sent from the assemblage ARC ship and were directed to its master AI here on Earth. The initial bits also indicated that a significant high-bandwidth data transmission was to follow shortly. Minervus quickly sent out an urgent action message to the full AI Advisory Council, preparing it for possible emergency actions. A series of follow-on messages were prepared just in case. These would be directed at all humans in Sol System. The subjects of the follow-on messages range from the rather benign, "Be aware," notices to the most extreme, "Begin full evacuation measures immediately." More data would be needed before sending any of the follow-on messages. It continued decoding the initial data. An index of the total data to be transmitted was discovered. Minervus noted that the total volume of data to be received was easily large enough to include multiple fully evolved digital presences. This likely indicated that the mine data for the long-anticipated enemy scouts would be arriving with this transmission. It sent a separate direct transmission to Dionys AI, instructing it to prepare the simulated reality project to receive its first enemy agents. Heels in the Sand Island, Earth, 34 hours later. "Excuse me, John. You have just received a high-priority textual message from your daughter, Kayla Abrams." "What?" I struggled to come fully awake. Kayla. She was still living in the SRP, right? A message. Was she finally ready to re-enter the real world and come visit? What's the message, Omu?" I managed to croak out. "The message is, Father, please come to the simulated reality project right away. A representative of the assemblage wishes to meet you."